Okay.
All right.
Uh-oh.
So I'm gonna record this just for posterity and because we might have some stragglers coming on and it looks like a couple of people had to decline for other things. But yeah, this is part two of the learning framework session on enterprise architecture. I'm sure Shane will just give a quick overview of last week, and we'll get started.
All right, cool.
Thanks.
Thanks, Andrew. So, yeah. So basically, last week when we went through this, what we were really trying to establish was really what is enterprise architecture, so that when somebody kind of has a hallway conversation with you and says, "Hey, I'm interested in doing some enterprise architecture work, or you need to work with this enterprise architect," you know what you're in for, right? So you just have some context about what that is and what's involved with that. This one I'm hoping will be a little bit more practical in that this is more of a, okay, now that you have an understanding of what it is, this is an approach to how to do it, right? So I'm hoping this one will be a little bit more from a practice standpoint, a little bit easier to apply. There's two main parts of this. We will probably just barely touch on the second part. As I was putting the agenda together, it was pretty clear to me that the first part's going to be pretty big. But that's okay. We can either do a follow-up or do some guided self-directed study. So to start with, let's just kind of recap what we talked about last week.
Sorry, I'm not ignoring you. I'm sending out a reminder to everybody.
We'll issue subpoenas if we have to. That's fine.
Yeah.
Okay, so first of all, what is EA? Somebody take a shot.
Enterprise architect.
Yep. What is it?
Damn. It is somebody who, oh gosh. Well, what is enterprise? It's the entire, I'm going to break, can I jump ahead?
Sure, go for it.
It's the entire, or I think of it as the entire organization as a whole and like how it runs. The architecture is like all the pieces and components that make up the enterprise to make it run, but the architecture is more like that bigger framework as opposed to the granular details of how everything runs specifically.
Right. So a key thing about architecture is how it dictates how things relate. Right? If you take nothing else away from kind of the definition of architecture, it's the interrelatedness of everything. Right? How does this component relate to this other component? That's really what architecture is about. So enterprise architecture, again, we'll go back to the original definition here. So it's a discipline, first and foremost, of proactively and holistically responding to change from outside forces, right? So something comes in, like a new business model, is presented, and we have to react to that. We have to think about, okay, what does that change, top to bottom, in the enterprise? What do we have to think about? What does that change from a business standpoint, from a technical standpoint, from our operations, all that kind of stuff. So it's the discipline of being proactive about that, responding to that change, leading it, and then sort of managing through it.
And disruptive, I find oftentimes has a negative connotation, but isn't this way? It's not necessarily negative.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah. Some disruptions are good. Yep. Okay. So that's basically it from a definition standpoint. Okay. So part two here is really going to be focused on frameworks. And there's two main frameworks we're gonna take into consideration. Before we do that, I want you to just stop and think for a moment. So imagine if you're assigned basically to be a solution architect for a new financial system implementation, right? Like it's a brand new client, brand new gig, and that's your role. You're the solution architect that has to lead a financial system implementation. So you start?
Understand the business, I guess, is where I would probably start. What do you do here? What's the value added? Um,
Yeah.
I guess that's probably what my logical. I'm not sure if that's necessarily correct, but
There's
that's
no right
where
or
I would
wrong
go.
answer here. This is just to inspire some thought.
Right.
Yeah,
So you-
I
a business
I
standpoint.
agree.
Okay. Not a bad place to start. Because you have to also think about sort of, again, kind of what we talked about before, right? What's your strategy? What's your objective,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's more than laying in a new financial system, right? Why are you doing that?
Mm-hmm.
Like what's the key driver behind doing that,
Mhm.
and what does that impact? So yeah, starting from a business perspective is a good thing.
Well, yeah, I guess what's the objective? And then, so what are the questions that answer that objective? And I
Right.
guess working backwards from there.
Yeah.
I think for me, I would start with that three-level diagram that you showed last time
Uh-huh.
and try to find out who's that person who stays between that top blue box and the bottom layer,
Right.
right? And then see, I mean, when you say business objective, I think different organizations might have different people carrying out that role. So probably I would try to find out an EA. If I'm a solution architect, I think I would try to find out an enterprise architect who's already there, if available, and
Hmm.
see, what exactly are we trying to solve here end to end.
Right. Right. So start thinking about the organization, like who your contacts are, who
Yeah.
roles and responsibilities, who are going to be your key supporters, your key detractors, those kinds of things. Yep, absolutely. Yep. How would you plan your work, and what would your work be? Right? You're being brought in, like you're the expert.
Mm-hmm.
So you're sitting down with the PM, and he or she says, "Okay, what's your plan? What does it look like?"
I think identify the systems to start with.
Uh huh.
So once you've known what are we trying to do, then I think you need to start thinking about, what are the different things involved. I would say things. I wouldn't name them as systems. It might be business processes. It might be actual systems per se. But
Right.
then you have to kind of like categorize what are the list of things involved to achieve that vision that we were talking about. That sound?
Yeah, it's. I mean, I like to think of it as kind of the placemat exercise,
Yeah,
which is what are all the things I need to be thinking about,
right.
right? Get them all on the table. We'll categorize them later,
Mm-hmm.
but right now let's just throw them all on the table. Right? It's a big jumbled mess,
Okay.
right? So that's a good thought. Yep. Okay. What would be some typical deliverables?
A strategic plan, maybe, or I mean, I don't see enterprise architecture as like the deliverables. You're not going to be necessarily implementing. You're going to be kind of on the analysis side of things at a really high level, and you're going to be in a strategic planning, uh, phase.
Mhm.
And so your deliverables are kind of the roadmap, or maybe an analysis of like the as-is state of the architecture as a whole.
Okay.
I would also say probably some diagrams of like current state, future state, how the pieces fit together, how all the pieces are related. I like the word related.
Yep.
Hmm.
Yep.
Yeah.
Matun, you gonna say something?
No, I'm listening.
Okay. These are all great answers, and this is intentionally hard, right? That's the point. This is hard.
That's why
Right?
you bring something. Right.
So I'll just cut to the chase here. So the reason we have architecture frameworks is to address all of those challenges, right? Is to give some structure to how we approach architecture, so that when we say we're building a solution architecture for something, we're using a common language, we have a common set of deliverables, we have a common process. It's structured, right? Rather than, hey, I'm just gonna kind of land and kind of figure it out, right? So it's meant to provide structure around this. That's the whole purpose behind having a framework. So basically, what are we talking about when we say framework? It's the combination of practices and artifacts, really, at the end of the day. So it's the process for how we do it, and it's the outcome. It's the actual it, right? It's the thing that we did. Okay. So there's two things we're going to consider here. So there's architecture frameworks and modeling frameworks. So the thing on the left is the architecture framework. The thing on the right is your modeling framework. So an architecture framework is really process focused, right? It's how we do architecture, just from a, how do we plan it out? A modeling framework is a little bit lower level. It's the tools. So it's what kinds of artifacts are you creating? And, it's defining the standards for those artifacts. Has anybody worked with UML in the past?
A little bit, yeah.
Oh yeah, sequence diagrams.
Yeah.
That's UML.
Yep.
So UML is an early kind of attempt at that, is to try to standardize, because you guys have all probably seen, the crazy diagrams that people produce that represent everything under the sun, right? And this is all, you'll also see references to the 4+1 view, architecture viewpoint. The key thing there is that you can't represent everything in one diagram, and don't try, right? So think about what layer you're trying to represent. Is this the business layer? Is this the data layer? Is this the application layer? And again, how do those things relate to each other? That's what you're trying to convey in a diagram. So you've probably all seen the crazy diagrams that have weird icons and GIFs and cell towers combined with computers, combined with firewall, just crazy diagrams, right? And you're sitting there trying to interpret. You don't understand the point of the diagram because you're lost in looking at all the icons going, what does this stuff mean, right? So that's the thing on the right, standardizing that, right? Giving you a common set of objects that you can use and how they relate to one another, and some common diagrams. So again, UML is kind of the older standard on that. Archimate is the newer one. And on the left, from a architecture framework perspective, TOGAF is the one that we're going to be digging into.
And are there frameworks, or are there artifacts that come out of the architecture frameworks?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. In fact, what you'll see is that they define kind of what artifacts are valuable, but they won't define what those artifacts should look like.
Right. Okay.
Right. And so it's defining, yes, you probably should have a business process diagram, and it should convey these things, but it won't give you a template for that. Well, in fact, it actually does give you a template for it, but it's not part of the standard. Whereas the thing on the right is standardizing that.
Right.
Okay, so starting with TOGAF. So again, this defines kind of the how, the process. So TOGAF stands for the Open Group Architecture Framework. You guys can read it. I'm not going to drain that. But basically, it's a big kind of worldwide conglomerate. And what's kind of cool is they've been around for a long time, and they manage a lot of standards that you may be familiar with. So Unix, in particular, that's owned by TOGAF, that's owned by the Open Group now. DCOM, Corba was one that's owned and managed by the Open Group. So yeah, it's basically just a standards body. It's kind of like ISO. Some key pillars on the right. So of TOGAF, the three things to really, like if you're going to do a 5-minute hallway conversation about TOGAF, these are the three things you should talk about, right? There's different domains of architecture. There's a method that goes with it, and that's the one everybody kind of, that's the key one.
Kind of domains?
Business
Yeah.
architecture,
Mm-hmm.
apps and data architecture,
Okay.
technology architecture.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So those are your discrete domains.
Right.
And you'll see that in
Okay.
the diagram coming up. And then the third thing is something called the enterprise continuum, which can be confusing, but it's basically just a way to organize all your things that are reusable in an enterprise. We'll see an example of that in a minute. So, key pillars of TOGAF. Architecture domains, there's a method called the ADM, and the enterprise continuum. Okay. I really want to, dang it, I had animations. Anyway.
I think you can play them on the side there.
Yeah, but then
You want to do them.
we can try it one more time. Do something different. Can you guys see that?
I can't see you sharing anything anymore.
Here, let me make one little fix.
Oh, if you click there, try and can you get to that one?
Oh, there we go. There we go.
You like literally have to click there.
Yeah, exactly. Can you guys see that?
Yes.
Yay! All right. Thanks, Andrew. All right. So remember I said there's three pillars to TOGAF. This is really, if you're going to take anything away, take this one away. This is the most important. It's the process. So they call it the ADM, or the architecture development method. Right? So remember when I asked you, okay, so you land brand new on a client site, you're the solution architect. What's your process? How are you going to go about it? This is a prescriptive way for going about it. This is, to me, this is what's most useful out of TOGAF.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I'll tell you about TOGAF real quick is that it includes everything under the sun that you'll possibly ever encounter as part of an architecture exercise. It's meant to be tailored. It's giving you a toolbox full of things. You're meant to take bits and pieces out of that and apply it as appropriate, right? So that said, as we kind of walk this wheel, you're meant to just take the bits that are most appropriate for your project. Okay, so as I said, this represents a process, right? And it starts at the top with the preliminary phase. And this is usually only done once. And then we kind of walk this wheel for every architecture exercise, which would be basically every project or every phase of a project is another way to look at it. Any new initiative, you'd walk that wheel. Okay? So, first of all, preliminary phase. So this is really where you're establishing a capability. So this is the first time you're actually standing up your ability to do architecture. So this is creation of an EA team, or if you're the only EA on the project, this is you setting yourself up, right? So, what does that mean? That means understanding who your sponsors are,
Mm-hmm.
independent of a project.
Mm-hmm.
This is just, as an architect here on the ground, who do I interact with? What tools do I use? What's my process? Who do I have to get approvals from? What are my typical deliverables? Just defining all those things for yourself, independent of any project. It's just establishing your capability, right? And as you can imagine, if you're doing this, let's say you're doing this at Microsoft. I mean, that's a huge, the preliminary phase might take you 6 months, right? Because, that's a huge undertaking.
Mm-hmm.
Think of all the things we just talked about.
Mm-hmm.
What are your typical deliverables?
Mm-hmm.
What are your processes? Like architecture review boards is a common thing that's part of this. So what does that look like? Defining all those things. We usually only do that once, and once you sort of have approval from your sponsor, whoever that is, if it's your director or CIO, once you got sign off, then you're off to the races. Then you can start actually doing architecture. Okay. So when you get a new request that comes in, again, let's take that example of a new finance project that's kicking off. You start with an architecture vision. So we call that A. Vision. So you always refer to these as the letters, so A. Vision, B. Business architecture, and so forth. So in the architecture vision phase, so this is where you're really just you're doing a notional, high level, this is what I understand about what you're trying to do. So this is kind of a high level aspirational architecture. Very high level. We call it like 0.1 version.
Hmm.
Um,
Is this mostly just discourse, or are there artifacts that come out of this as well?
there can be.
Yeah.
There can be. And a lot of this depends on how rapidly you try to run this cycle.
Right.
Right. So, I mean, I've seen projects where you try to go through the whole cycle in a sprint cycle, like in a 2-week time frame. And if you have enough architects in your well-oiled machine, you know, you can probably accomplish that. But that means your artifacts are going to be super light, right? It's all hallway conversations or emails or things like that. But in a more typical setup, your architecture vision would be a diagram on a piece of paper, like literally, you know, back of the cocktail napkin stuff, you know, whiteboard, you know, screenshots. Just let's get in a room, let's figure out what this thing is, let's draw a couple pictures. This is what we think it looks like. So I'll tell you where else this is extremely applicable is when you're building a proposal, right? When you're putting together a proposal, you're doing an architecture vision. You're really saying, I know almost nothing about this organization or what they're trying to do, but based on what I do know, this is where I think they're trying to go, right? So that's kind of what the vision's all about, establishing that. So the B.business architecture, what do you think we're handling there? Take some guesses.
That's actually like the business and how the business is run, like not from necessarily the technical perspective, but from like what do they do as a business? What's their business process?
Absolutely. So some other elements that are related to that, geography is a huge one. So if they do business internationally or, you know, across several states, and their core business is something that's sensitive to state legislations, for instance, you have to think about that. Like that's the phase where you start bringing in some of that information. Understanding your organization. So who reports to who manages what? How is the business compartmentalized? Is it do they have a lot of sub brands, sort of a thing? Do they have partners that you have to consider as part of the architecture?
Stakeholders, I was thinking. Those are oftentimes the ones that go unmentioned.
Right.
We don't even realize who they are.
Yeah. I mean, we have some hidden ones here at the foundation that nobody's really talked about for Wave 2. I mean, we've got business partners. Right. So that's going to come in probably, you know, Wave 3, Wave 4, or something like that. But you don't hear much about it right now. So it's everything, like Leah said, everything about the business and how the business runs. Why is that important? Why do we care? Why don't we just get to building something?
because we want to be able to support the business process. That like the business comes before the technology. The technology should support the business process, not vice versa.
You could get into a place where you're actually inhibiting the business process with the development.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, you know, in what we specialize in, particularly in the integration space, very tightly coupled to business process.
Yes.
If you do not understand the business process, you are not going to build the right integration. Hands down, every time.
Yes.
So business process is huge. If that's your one takeaway out of the B button, right? Just figure out what the business process is. Okay. The information systems architecture. So I like to just call this the apps and data bubble, because it's really, that's how TOGAF looks at it. If you double click on that, it's really comprised of, they separate it into two mini bubbles within there. There's an applications side and there's a data side. So on the applications side, it's really your application architecture. So again, taking our finance system example. So this is where you would think about, okay, what's the ecosystem of applications that have to interact with a finance system that we have to think about? This is also where integrations come in huge, right? So you think about the integration landscape. This is also where you have to go deep on the new finance system you're recommending, right? You have to think about the requirements around that. And that's just on the application side.
Mm-hmm.
On the data side, it's all about data architecture. So it's figuring out what, for all the systems you're interacting with, what are the data models within those systems, because you're going to have to build source to target maps for things, right? You're going to have to think about data migration, right? Understanding data dependency is huge. So here at the foundation, they didn't realize until halfway through the project that they were going to have to change their cost center values. Imagine the ripple impact of changing your cost centers. How many different systems do you think that impacts? Almost everyone.
Yeah.
Almost every
Right.
system.
Right.
Yeah. So it's thinking about sort of data impacts,
Right.
traceability, things like that. So that's information systems. So that's C. D bubble. What do we think that is? Technology architecture. This is somewhat counterintuitive to some folks. They think technology is the upper level.
Yeah.
TOGAF looks at technology as, think of it as your utilities. So all the things you kind of take for granted, your network, firewall,
Mm-hmm.
server infrastructure,
Right.
what else? What are some security? All those kind of just nagging things that you have to deal with, but aren't truly part of the business value of the solution, right?
Yeah, a quick thing I remembered from my Univar days is that we specifically, when we were doing the initial estimation and stuff, I remember Rajiv specifically mentioning them that, we are not taking care of the infrastructure for the for the Informatica stuff and all, because once you get into that, that is when we have to think about the, the technology architecture and all that stuff, and you definitely have to have a lot of involved time
Yeah.
allocated for that, right, Shane? Do you,
Yeah.
yeah.
No,
So,
absolutely. Yeah.
yeah. So, I mean, I learned that from a couple of estimations that I did for a few projects. Initially I did not understand what exactly Rajiv was saying, but then eventually it turned out that, once you take in all that entire tech architecture and infrastructure architecture and networks and all that stuff, you are in for a big, big thing. Because
Yeah.
most of the organizations have a different viewpoint and perspective on that.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. So, and some are more open than others.
Right.
Some require you
That's
to.
that's a very great point.
Yeah. Yep. So, yeah. Again, think about that in your proposal work. How much time will you spend in that D bubble if you're coming into an existing organization that already has like an ESB or an iPaaS solution in place, and
Right.
you're if you're just adding new integrations versus you're laying in a new foundation of iPaaS,
Mm-hmm.
right? D becomes huge in
Yeah.
that space. Okay. So again, this is a cycle, right? We're thinking of how do we evolve this solution. And the other thing that's happening, by the way, between each of these bubbles is that in that architecture vision, you're creating kind of that notional future state architecture. As we're going through each of these, you're elaborating that architecture. So think of it as one deliverable that you're constantly updating as you go through each of these phases. So you start with an architecture vision. We've gone through the business architecture. Now we've captured all the salient points from that business architecture. We understand what all the business processes are. We understand how the organization is structured. We understand if there's any geographic impacts we have to think about. And then we go into the information systems architecture. Again, we're updating that future state architecture, right, as we go.
Mm-hmm.
So information systems architecture, so it's apps and data. So we've captured the data models that are relevant. It could be source to target maps, things like that. We're updating that architecture as we walk the cycle. Technology architecture, we've identified, like all the things that Mithun just talked about, right? So where the firewalls we're going to have to think about, we're doing a bunch of FTPs, we have to think about file servers, security, all those kinds of things. So now we're into the opportunities and solutions. So at this point, you should have a fairly evolved future state architecture. You kind of understand at this point what you're building, right? So now opportunities and solutions is really about thinking about buy versus build. So we're at a point now, do we build a bunch of custom stuff? Do we just buy something off the shelf, or is it a hybrid? We're going to have to buy something off the shelf, but we're going to have to do a lot of heavy customization on top of that. Increasingly more and more these days, it's a buy decision, right? Because there's so many SaaS-based solutions out there. So really in this phase, what you're doing is you're identifying, how am I going to have to extend or customize what's not provided out of box. So that's what you're doing there. Okay, continuing to walk the bubble. So we understand now kind of what the solution looks like. Now we have to plan it. So migration planning, again, probably bad choice of words here, but this is all about the project management, right? This is, now we know how to proceed with this thing and we're just managing it as a project.
Just to bring it back just a little bit, when you were talking about opportunities and solutions, should you understand the resources available? And by that, I mean, what are the financial resources? What are your, human resources that you're going to be available? Is that something that should be discovered in the preliminary phase, or is that kind of part of the business architecture? Is that usually hashed out initially, or are you kind of digging into that a little bit later once you get into the business side of things?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So you wouldn't really deal with it in preliminary phase. Preliminary, again, is just, I'm just creating my ability to be an architect in the foundation, right? Where you would really get into that is in opportunities and solutions, because that's what we call a constraint on the solution. So it kind of depends on how the solution is being run. So you either have that as a guiding constraint for the solution, or you assume at the start that you have infinite resources, and then you kind of report back and say, this is what I'm going to need.
Right.
So it just kind of depends on what the client's asking for there. Good question. So,
hey guys, I might have to just drop off at this point. I have an appointment at 1, so you guys go ahead. But nice presentation, Shane. Thank you so much.
Oh, all right. Yeah, take care, man.
Yeah, take care. Yeah, bye.
Okay. All right. So, promise we'll get through this very quickly here. Migration planning. So again, that's project management. Implementation governance. So as an enterprise architect, part of what you're responsible for doing is ensuring the thing that you specified is actually being built, right? Because it's nice to say, hey, this is what the solution should look like, but if you're not following up and reviewing things, it becomes divergent, right? You end up with something that doesn't address the problem that you're trying to solve. So that's implementation governance. Architecture change management. So this is where we're closing out the architecture. So the project's been delivered, and we're basically taking the future state architecture and making it current state.
Right.
This is our new baseline. We're there. Right. Updating all of our documentation, updating the repository, all those things. So that's the whole cycle.
And does that tie into, because you have it's cyclical in a way, and I can see it's not linear because you're coming back to, does H address A?
Yeah.
I mean, at the end of the day,
right. Right. The thing that we just delivered and put into production, did it actually meet what we were trying to do? And you'll see some projects will have retrospectives, to see, was it aligned? Did we save X amount of dollars? Did we deliver X amount of widgets? Those kinds of things. So the other thing to keep in mind here is that these things are grouped sort of logically, right? So we call this part right here the architecture context. So it's like, again, you're getting your bearings. You're figuring out what is this thing you're trying to do, and just sort of establishing that baseline understanding. So that's the context phase of it. Delivery phase, this is where you're doing all the heavy lifting as an architect, right? You've got to go to every meeting, every single meeting, right? And you're doing a lot of documentation, a lot of diagramming, all that stuff, right? So that's architecture delivery. Project delivery is, okay, the project is firing on all cylinders. People are building stuff, they're testing stuff, that kind of stuff. And then architecture governance is now we're wrapping it all up, right? We've delivered it, and let's, commit it to the repository, so that the next architect that shows up has something that he can go to and reuse. And then there's how this whole process integrates with external processes, right? Because that's the other thing you have to keep in mind. Because you can show up on a client site and say, okay, I've got this process that I'm going to follow. And they'll say, yeah, that's great, but we have our own processes for all these things. So this is where that comes into play, right? So this is what you'll typically see, is that from an architecture delivery standpoint, you're probably going to interact with build processes and testing processes, right? So CI/CD, the most common one there. So we have that here at the foundation. That's what, their automated build stuff is all about. Project delivery, whatever the PMO process is around that. Could be Agile, could be Scrum, could be strict waterfall, could be WAGA, whatever. It's just whatever the PMO's process is, you're going to have to interact with that somehow. And so this is typically where the interaction is going to occur. It's between these two bubbles. And then ITIL, so, basically change management, architecture change management. So that's, a lot of people are really big on ITIL, and they'll want you to follow that. And then, that should have actually been the first one, but basically when you're kicking off a project, this is your project portfolio management. So if you're in a functioning EA program, you'll be pulled into a lot of the what if conversations. What if we decided to open a new factory in Malaysia? What would that look like? Right? You might get pulled into that conversation. So that's your portfolio management. Should that be a project?
Mm-hmm.
Or should it not? Right? So that's what that's all about. So that's a lot of stuff, but really, that's the bulk of TOGAF. That's it.
That's it.
That's it. Now, there's a lot of detail under those buttons.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So each one of those defines a bunch of sample templates, artifacts, proposed processes, roles, responsibilities, all those things. And that's really what the TOGAF specification is about, is digging into each one of those and saying, what should you be doing in that phase?
Yeah.
So if you want some light reading, if you're having trouble sleeping at night, go pull up the TOGAF specification.
Good.
Or you do what I do and you just customize it. I'm going to go through this super quickly. So this is another pillar of TOGAF. It's called the Enterprise Continuum. All this is really about is saying that there's a bunch of architectures that start from, on the left side, they start from very broad and not very specific to very tailored and not reusable and very specific to a certain organization from an architecture standpoint. From a solution standpoint, same thing, right? You have solutions that are very broad that can apply to anything. And, as you kind of move up this continuum, you get to an organization-specific solution that can't be applied anywhere else. So,
is a lot of this left to right found with organizations that had EA in mind from inception versus organizations that kind of,
yeah.
jumped into it a little bit later?
No, that's a great call out. So, again, going back to the earlier mental exercise, you have no framework whatsoever. You just show up. You're the solution architect for this new project. You're going to develop something very specific here,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's not reusable in any way, shape, or form. It's just how you work, right? And it's going to have the deliverables that you normally create, all those things, which is fine. But it's not going to be, somebody else may have to pick up that work later on or refer to it later on, and they may not know what they're looking at, right? So that's just what this is about. All right, we won't go through the quiz. I'll let you take the quiz later. Okay, so Archimate. So go back a step. Remember we said there's basically the process framework, that's TOGAF, and then there's the there's the methodology, and then there's the actual deliverables framework. So this is about the deliverables. This is what do these things look like, right? To ensure that we're all kind of speaking the same language. So Archimate, so at a high level, it's really composed of 3 core components. So you have these things called components, right? These are the objects on the page. So there's different buckets and categories of these guys, and we'll talk through each one of those. There's the relationships. There's that word again. There's the relationships between the components. That's the core part of architecture. That's why we're even doing this thing. And then there's all the connectors that you use to represent those relationships. This is where the bulk of the complexity with Archimate comes from. As you can see, there's 4, 8, 12. Am I counting those right? Yeah, so there's 12 different connectors you can use, and only certain connectors work with certain components. And so if you're trying to build a diagram, it won't let you do certain things. And it can be really frustrating. You're like, damn it, I just want to connect that line. Oh, I'm using the wrong kind of line, right? So that's both the positive and the negative for Archimate, right? The positive is that you can't build something outside of the standard that somebody else can't understand, right? The negative is you've got to spend some time figuring out all those rules. Okay, so remember we talked about components. So there's 3 main classes of components. We're going to look at each one of those. So there's behavioral components. So these are things that can act, right? So a business process or a function or an interaction, an event. These are all like active concepts, right? And there's 3 layers for each one of these. There's a business layer, an application layer, and a technology layer, right? These all do something. A service does something. Function does something. So Archimate draws that distinction between things that can do stuff, things that are acted upon, and things that are passive. Okay, so these are about the active ones. Actually, I think I got that wrong. Passive structure. See, Archimate's confusing. Behavior. I have this switched. I don't think so. Okay, so again, this is kind of divided into 3 layers. So business, apps, technology. You'll find the same thing in passive structures. So so I misspoke earlier. These are the things that can do stuff, right? Active structure components. This is the combination of the active and the passive. It's what's the thing that's happening. As you can see, there's like things like interactions and functions. That's the intersection of an activity and the thing being acted upon. So active structure concept. So again, there's a business layer, app layer, technology layer. As you would expect, so if I jump to the technology layer, remember kind of what we talked about in TOGAF. These are very technology-focused things, right? There's a network, a device, like it's all technology heavy.
Do most of these layers, when you're diagramming, do they stay within the layer? So if you're doing technology, behavioral concepts, components, these structural, those are interacting with each other, or do you have technology layers interacting with business layer?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So in most viewpoints, you'll see one boundary being crossed.
Okay.
Right. So it's usually business layer mapping to an application layer, or application layer mapping to a technology layer. Okay. There is one viewpoint that allows all 3 layers, and it's called the layered viewpoint. Go figure. And that is a great one to use for, remember we talked about sort of that your architecture vision, like your whiteboard, most whiteboard diagrams are that way, right? It's all three layers, like we're just going to map it all out.
Right.
So yeah, so that's the one exception to that rule. Good question. Passive structure. So these are all the things being acted upon, right? And I can say the one that's most useful in most of the diagramming that I've done is artifact. Some of these are, it's a little overwrought. Again, I tailor this. I take the bits that make the most sense and use them. I kind of throw the rest away.
Yeah.
An artifact is just like, it's a piece of information. So it's can either be a message, it could be a file that's stored on disk, anything like that. Yeah. So those are all basically your icons. Think of them that way. Those little things you can drag and drop and connect. Okay. Now this is a mapping. So I think I told you, maybe I didn't. I'll tell you now if I didn't. That the Open Group manages both Archimate and TOGAF. They actually just recently acquired Archimate. Archimate used to be an independent standard. So the Open Group actually picked that up. And now what they're doing is they're merging the two. And so this shows how you can layer, or sorry, how you can map an Archimate viewpoint to a TOGAF phase, right? So you have your TOGAF phase on the right, and the Archimate viewpoint that makes the most sense on the left. So remember, we just talked about the layered viewpoint. Business process viewpoint, no surprise there, right? Business function. So the one that I use most often from an integration standpoint is this one, called application cooperation viewpoint. I love the names of these things. I just call it an integration diagram. But essentially that's what it is. It shows how applications exchange data with one another. And these we don't deal with too much, but like if you were managing a network or something like that, you'd be down in this layer. Okay. Again, this is kind of another way to show the relationship between the two. Let you guys look at that one later. Okay, putting it all together. What are we doing on time?
Yeah, 7 minutes.
Okay. I think this will be my last slide, and I'll leave it to questions. Okay, so this is the Gates Foundation example. So this is a basically a customization that I did for their EA team to marry up TOGAF and Archimate. So, do you recognize anything across the top?
Yeah, it looks like the TOGAF.
Yeah, it's ADM. Yeah, but it's customized, so it doesn't have all the bubbles because a lot of the other bubbles for this particular organization just don't make a lot of sense. So they're not big on architecture governance. In fact, we weren't allowed to say that word. So it's like, okay, don't do it. That's fine. We don't have to do it. But this basically shows, as EAs, this is how we help projects get delivered, right? And what happens in each of these phases. This is done once, and this is done in a cycle for every new project. And then we hand it off to the PMO. Like, okay, it's ready to build.
Yeah.
Let's build it.
Yeah.
Right. And then the other thing is that this sort of overlays your typical viewpoints as well as why it's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So let's jump over to application architecture, because again, that's where we say integrations live. The other thing I did is I tried to summarize each one of the phases with like a value statement, right? Why are we doing architecture or application architecture? Why bother? Well, it's so we understand what applications we have, which ones we need, which ones require build and customizations, and how it all works together.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So what are some of the deliverables out of application architecture? Well, application cooperation viewpoint, your integration diagrams, right? App usage. So this maps the applications to core capabilities. So Leah, I know you were working with David on getting some business capability stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's where that comes into play, right? Application structure viewpoint. So if you need to decompose, again, a finance system, what are the modules of a finance system? What does that look like? API specs, obviously. And then if you deploy something into production, like what's the run book for how we manage that, right? This is all, it's tailored. So, any questions on that? Does that make sense? Okay. So maybe just really quickly, I'll just kind of walk you through a couple of just Archimate views, just so you can kind of see what they look like. I'm going to stop on this one. So, so I built this one for FE. Part of the challenge we were having is there was no bucketing of any of the functionality. Like we didn't even know, there was no concept of a work stream. Imagine that. There were just a bunch of loose requirements that people were scrambling around trying to figure out. And so I built this as a way, at least in my head, to try to think about what does this relate to? So if I'm looking at a specific requirement, what does it tie back to? Right? And it just gave us a way to sort of think about, you know, basically the bucketing of the requirements, right? What's the work stream? Who needs to be involved? Who needs to show up at those meetings? All those kinds of things, right? So that's one way that a business function viewpoint can be useful. Business process viewpoint. So you guys probably have seen business process flows before. So how does this look different?
Well, you have the business process flow, and then you have the application components that kind of relate to them.
Yeah, no swim lanes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. No swim lanes.
Right. So it's a much simpler, although this example doesn't look too simple, but generally it's it's a much more simplified view of a business process. Right. It's a higher level abstraction, right? Discrete steps, and then business functions that those steps support.
Instead of the roles and responsibilities.
Right.
That, like, yeah.
Right.
Technological components.
Exactly.
Application.
Yeah. Let's see. Okay. Yeah. So here's another one that I did. So integration diagram, essentially. Right. So it's showing all your applications. It shows, you know, basically the integration layer, and then lines indicating the direction flow of information. Right. So if you ever want to start mapping out the technology layer, this is an example of that. So these represent domains. So you have the Azure domain, you have BMGF on-premise. These are nodes. So this is very hardware kind of centric. Right. Okay. Resources. So Wayne is really good at this stuff as well. So feel free to reach out to him. No, myself certainly. I just didn't want to beat my chest like I'm the guy. But yeah, in addition to me, Wayne, David Rowe, and Sue Allen. Sue's great on business architecture. So if you want, like, just schedule a half hour with her if you ever really want to understand a way to kind of decompose like business processes. She's really good at that. So, cool. I also have all the TOGAF materials on a Dropbox folder and all the Archimate materials as well. So if you ever get curious, or if you need inspiration, sometimes I do this. Like if I just, I want to capture this in some kind of viewpoint, but I don't know what diagram to use. I'll go digging through the Archimate examples or the TOGAF examples. Yeah. So.
Awesome. Man, we're at time. That's actually perfect. All right, everybody. Thanks for joining. thank you, Shane, for leading us through that little exploration. And we will be returning to this in 3 weeks, actually, given some vacation time.
Who's next on deck?
Mithun will be doing sequel in our next Learning
Sweet.
Framework session. So, just thanks again for everybody for showing up. I'll be putting a recording of this up on the SharePoint as well as a link to the deck from today, and look forward to seeing you all soon.
Great. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Shane.
Thanks, Shane.
Bet.
Thanks,
Bye.
Shane. That's awesome. Thank you.